The February chill had turned bitter in Greystone, Connecticut. Snow fell in lazy spirals, gathering on the cobblestone streets of a town where old money whispered louder than new scandal. The kind of place where reputation was currency and secrets were vaults that rarely opened. Margot Ellery pulled her wool coat tighter as she hurried down Marlowe Street, her breath clouding before her. At 36, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew things others didn't. Tonight was no exception. The leather messenger bag slung across her body felt heavier than usual, though it contained only a few documents and her ever-present notebook. Holden and Reeve loomed ahead, its red brick facade standing proudly among the colonial architecture. The auction house had been a fixture in Greystone since 1892, handling the treasures and trinkets of New England's elite with white-gloved discretion. Margot had worked there for 11 years. Tonight would be her last, though she didn't know it yet. She nodded to the night guard, Gerald, who tipped his cap in return. "Working late again, Ms. Ellery?" he asked, buzzing her through the employee entrance. "Just finishing up the Blackwell estate paperwork," she replied, offering a tight smile. "Should be out by 10. Gerald's weathered face crinkled with concern. "Third night this week. You ought to get some rest." "Soon," she promised, already heading toward the back hallway. The auction house was eerily quiet at night. During business hours, it hummed with the steady murmur of appraisals, the click of heels on hardwood floors, and the occasional gasp when a bid exceeded expectations. Now, the silence pressed against her ears as she made her way to her office, passing darkened display cases holding tomorrow's treasures. She paused at the security panel, frowning at the small red light on camera 12, the one monitoring the back hallway leading to her office. Offline again. She'd mentioned this to building security twice now. Another item for tomorrow's to-do list, she thought, unlocking her office door. The room was modest but elegantly appointed, befitting a lead appraiser at Holden and Reeve. Antique desk, green banker's lamp, walls adorned with prints of masterpieces she'd authenticated over the years. But Margot's eyes went straight to the cardboard box sitting on her desk, labeled simply, Blackwell Estate, Lot 42. She hung her coat carefully, set down her bag, and started the electric kettle she kept on the credenza. Black tea would help her focus. This would be a long night. 3 hours later, Margot stared at the document in her hands, her tea long forgotten and grown cold. The birth certificate shouldn't exist. According to every official record, Agnes Blackwell had been childless. Yet here was evidence of a son, born in 1965, who would have legitimate claim to the entire estate, and more importantly, the art collection that had caused such a stir in auction circles. The collection that Travis Dean had pushed through appraisal with unusual haste. She reached for her phone, then hesitated. Who could she trust? In the 11 years she'd worked at Holden and Reeve, she'd learned that appearances were just that, appearances. People showed you what they wanted you to see. It was her job to look deeper, to authenticate, to separate genuine from forgery. Her finger hovered over Detective Michael Sullivan's number. They'd dated briefly 2 years ago, and while the romance had faded, their friendship remained intact. He would know what to do, but calling the police would mean no turning back. The soft knock at her door made her jump. "Burning the midnight oil again, Margot?" Travis Dean leaned against the doorframe, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. At 42, Dean had the polished look of old money, tailored suit, signet ring, and hair just starting to silver at the temples. As assistant director of Holden and Reeve, he oversaw major acquisitions and had personally handled the Blackwell estate. "Just dotting my I's and crossing my T's," she said, casually sliding the birth certificate under a folder. "The Moretti auction is next week." "Always the perfectionist," he said, stepping into her office uninvited. His gaze swept over the open box of Blackwell documents. "I thought we'd closed the Blackwell file." "Almost," she said. "Just a few inconsistencies I wanted to clear up." He nodded slowly. "Anything I should know about?" "Nothing concrete yet," she hedged. I've requested a meeting with the Blackwell family attorney. Just to clarify some provenance questions. Something hardened in Dean's expression, so briefly she almost missed it. Then his charming smile returned. Always thorough. That's why you're our best. He glanced at her cold tea. You should get some fresh tea. I'm heading to the break room, let me bring you back a cup. Before she could refuse, he'd picked up her mug and disappeared down the hallway. Margot's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her phone again. She needed to document everything before speaking to the attorney. Opening her camera app, she began photographing the suspicious documents, including the birth certificate of Agnes Blackwell's supposed son. 15 minutes later, Travis returned with a steaming mug of tea. Sorry for the delay, he said, setting it on her desk. Got caught up in an email. You've got about another hour before Gerald makes his rounds. Thanks, she said, not touching the tea. After Travis left, Margot stared at the mug. Something felt off. The tea was darker than usual, almost bitter-smelling. She pushed it aside and returned to her work, taking more photos and making notes. When the dizzy spell hit her 20 minutes later, she initially blamed exhaustion. When her fingers went numb and her vision blurred, she realized with icy clarity what was happening. The tea. She lunged for her phone, knocking it to the floor. As she slid from her chair, her body already failing her, she reached desperately for her bag. With the last of her strength, she removed the flash drive from her laptop and, using techniques learned from her father, a former intelligence officer, she slid it into a hidden compartment in the lining of her handbag. Her last thought before consciousness faded was of the message she'd sent to her journalist friend Carol that morning: if I disappear, start with the third bidder from Lot 42. Detective Michael Sullivan stood in Margot's office the next morning, his face grim as the medical examiner confirmed what the scene suggested: cyanide poisoning. The tea mug sat on her desk, a lipstick smudge on its rim the only evidence she'd taken a sip. No fingerprints on the mug besides the victim's partial on the handle, said the forensic tech. Wiped clean otherwise. Sullivan nodded, his blue eyes scanning the room. At 41, he'd seen plenty of death in his 17 years with the Greystone Police Department, but this one hit differently. He and Margot had parted amicably, remaining friends who occasionally met for coffee to discuss his cases or her latest fascinating find. Camera status, he asked, already knowing part of the answer. Back hallway camera has been offline since 7 p.m., replied Officer Chin, checking her notes. Maintenance request filed 3 days ago. Third time in 2 months it's happened. Convenient, Sullivan muttered. What about the other cameras? Show Dean leaving at 9:15 p.m. Guard found her at 10:30 during rounds. Sullivan approached Margot's desk, careful not to disturb the scene. The box labeled Blackwell Estate, Lot 42, was open, papers scattered across the surface. Whatever she'd been working on, it had consumed her attention. Sir, Officer Chin called from the doorway. Mr. Holden is here. Robert Holden, 78 and still impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, entered the office with the stiffness of age and shock. As the senior partner of Holden and Reeve, he'd built the auction house into one of the most respected in New England. This is unthinkable, he said, his voice wavering slightly. Margot was exceptional. Irreplaceable. I understand this is difficult, Mr. Holden, Sullivan said, but I need to ask about the Blackwell estate. Margot appears to have been reviewing these files when she died. Holden's expression shifted. The Blackwell collection was significant. Old paintings, mostly 18th century landscapes and portraits. Agnes Blackwell was the last of her line, a reclusive widow who died 6 months ago. The estate sale was handled by her attorney, Preston Walsh. And who managed the sale for Holden and Reeve? Travis Dean, my assistant director. With Margot handling authentication and appraisal, of course. Sullivan made a note. I'll need to speak with Mr. Dean. Of course. He's devastated, they worked closely together. Holden hesitated. Detective, this will need to be handled with discretion. Many of our clients value their privacy above all else. Sullivan met the older man's gaze directly. Someone murdered Margot Ellery in your auction house, Mr. Holden. Discretion takes a back seat to justice. After Holden left, Sullivan turned back to the scene. Something nagged at him, an incongruity. Margot's meticulous nature extended to everything she did, yet her bag lay on the floor, contents partially spilled. Not like her at all. He crouched beside it, noting the standard items: wallet, keys, lipstick, notebook. A uniformed officer bagged each item for evidence. When the officer picked up the handbag itself, Sullivan noticed it had an unusual weight to it. "Hold on," he said, taking the bag and examining it more closely. Years of searching suspects had taught him about hidden compartments. His fingers found the subtle seam in the lining, revealing a slim flash drive. "Well, Margot," he murmured. "What did you find?" Travis Dean sat in the interview room, the picture of cooperative grief. His lawyer, Eleanor Withers, one of Connecticut's most expensive criminal defense attorneys, sat beside him, her presence raising Sullivan's suspicions further. "I brought Margot tea around 9 p.m., Dean said, his voice steady. "We discussed the upcoming Moretti auction." She seemed preoccupied, but that wasn't unusual. Margot was always thinking 3 steps ahead. "Did she mention concerns about the Blackwell estate?" Sullivan asked. A flicker of something, surprise. Alarm, crossed Dean's face. "Not specifically, no. The sale concluded weeks ago. Yet she was reviewing those files when she died." Dean shrugged elegantly. Margot was thorough. Perhaps she noticed something during final documentation. "Like forgeries?" Sullivan pressed. The lawyer intervened smoothly. "Detective, are you suggesting impropriety at Holden and Reeve? Because that's a serious allegation against my client's establishment." "I'm suggesting Margot Ellery found something worth killing for," Sullivan replied, watching Dean's face. "The back hallway camera has been offline for maintenance 3 times in 2 months. Always when Margot was working late." "If you're implying I had anything to do with those camera malfunctions," Dean began. "I'm not implying anything yet," Sullivan interrupted. "I'm establishing facts. Fact, you were the last person to see Margot alive. Fact, you brought her the tea that killed her. Fact, you directly oversaw the Blackwell estate sale that Margot was investigating when she died." Dean's composed facade cracked slightly. "That's circumstantial at best." "Perhaps," Sullivan conceded. "But we've only just begun investigating. For instance, we haven't yet discussed the shell company that placed the 3rd bid on Lot 42 of the Blackwell estate. Cayman Islands registration, if I recall correctly." This time, Dean couldn't hide his shock. The lawyer placed a warning hand on his arm. "My client has been fully cooperative," she said firmly. "Unless you're charging him, this interview is over." Sullivan smiled thinly. "For now." After they left, Lieutenant Gloria Ramirez joined Sullivan in the observation room. "How did you know about the shell company?" she asked. "That wasn't in any report I've seen." "I didn't," Sullivan admitted. "But Margot left a message about the 3rd bidder from lot number 42. Dean's reaction tells me there's something there." Speaking of messages, Ramirez said, "Tech just started analyzing that flash drive. It's encrypted, but they've accessed some files. You're going to want to see this." Carol Weber had built her career on hard-hitting investigative journalism. At 44, she'd exposed corrupt politicians, corporate fraud, and organized crime operations. But nothing had prepared her for the message from her friend Margot, or the news of her death the very next day. "If I disappear, start with the 3rd bidder from lot 42. She'd met with Detective Sullivan that morning, showing him the cryptic email. Now, sitting in her cramped office at the Greystone Chronicle, she dug deeper into the Blackwell estate sale. The public records showed 8 major lots sold at auction. Lot 42 contained 3 paintings attributed to Joshua Reynolds, the 18th-century English portrait artist. The winning bid came from the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. The second highest bidder was a private collector from New York. The third bidder, who dropped out at $3.2 million, was listed only as Blackwater Holdings LLC. Carol's research skills had been honed over 20 years of journalism. Within hours, she traced Blackwater Holdings through a maze of shell companies back to a parent corporation with only 2 shareholders, Travis Dean and his brother, Anthony Dean. The same Anthony Dean who'd been investigated, but never charged, for art-related money laundering in Spain 5 years earlier. Her phone rang. Sullivan. The flash drive was in Margot's bag, he said without preamble. Scans of forged documents, including what appears to be a fake will and birth certificate for a non-existent Blackwell heir. But here's where it gets interesting, there are also photos of paintings. Before and after shots. Before and after what? Carol asked. Before and after they were altered. Subtle changes to make them appear older, signature modifications. The metadata shows the photos were taken in a workshop registered to Anthony Dean, Carol finished. Travis's brother. I just connected him to the third bidder on lot 42. A moment of silence. How quickly can you meet me? The rain had started by the time Sullivan and Carol met at the Greystone Public Library, a neutral location away from prying eyes. They claimed a private study room in the back, spreading their findings on the table. Anthony Dean was investigated by Interpol for laundering money through art sales, Carol explained. He'd buy legitimate pieces, have them copied by forgers, then sell the forgeries through reputable auction houses while the real paintings went to private collectors who wouldn't ask questions. Buyers who needed to clean large sums of money, Sullivan nodded. The perfect scheme, except Interpol caught on. But couldn't prove it conclusively, Carol added. He walked away untouched. Sullivan tapped the flash drive. Until Margot started putting pieces together. Look at this, she found a pattern in the Blackwell paintings. 3 of them show brushstroke techniques that weren't used until decades after their supposed creation date. Good forgeries, but not perfect, Carol mused. And Margot had an exceptional eye. More than that, Sullivan said, pulling out another document. This is Agnes Blackwell's actual will from probate court. It specifically mentions donating her entire art collection to the Greystone Historical Society. Yet somehow, a new will appeared after her death, directing everything to a previously unknown second cousin. Who then authorized the sale through Halden and Reeve, Carol finished. With Travis Dean managing the process and his brother's company placed as a bidder to drive up prices. Or to acquire certain pieces they specifically needed, Sullivan suggested. Either way, Margot found inconsistencies. She requested a meeting with Preston Walsh, the Blackwell family attorney. Carol's eyes widened. Did that meeting happen? No. Walsh says she cancelled last minute. But his assistant remembers Margot sounding nervous on the phone, not like herself. They worked through the evidence for hours, connecting threads that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The Dean brothers hadn't just forged paintings, they'd created an entire false heir to the Blackwell estate, complete with birth certificate, school records, and a paper trail fabricated with exceptional care. But why kill her? Carol wondered aloud. If she went public with suspicions of forgery, it would damage the auction house's reputation, but they could claim they were deceived too. Sullivan's expression darkened. Because it wasn't just about the forgeries. Look at this. He pointed to a document bearing Agnes Blackwell's signature. Margot made a note here, different pressure patterns from known samples. Possible forgery executed while subject was incapacitated. Carol gasped softly. Are you saying that Agnes Blackwell may not have died of natural causes? That's exactly what I think Margot suspected. Sullivan gathered the documents. I need to request an exhumation order. If there's evidence of foul play. The study room door opened abruptly. Preston Walsh stood there, his expensive suit damp from the rain, his face ashen. "I've been looking everywhere for you, detective," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I found something in my files. Something about Agnes Blackwell that Margot must have discovered." The following days unfolded in a whirlwind of revelations. Agnes Blackwell's body was exhumed, and toxicology tests revealed trace amounts of a rare poison derived from mushrooms, slow-acting, difficult to detect, and mimicking the symptoms of natural heart failure in the elderly. Preston Walsh provided crucial evidence. Agnes had confided in him months before her death, expressing concern that someone was tampering with her medications. She'd also mentioned strange visits from a man claiming to be a distant relative, a man whose description matched Anthony Dean. The DA's office obtained search warrants for both Dean brothers' properties. At Anthony's workshop, they discovered forged paintings, documentation, and equipment used to age canvases artificially. At Travis's lake house, they found Agnes Blackwell's original will, the one leaving her collection to the Historical Society, half burned in the fireplace. What they didn't find was proof beyond reasonable doubt that Travis had poisoned Margot's tea. His fingerprints weren't on the mug, and the security footage showing him entering the break room had mysteriously corrupted. Travis Dean's lawyer argued that Margot had been emotionally unstable in recent weeks, had developed paranoid theories about the Blackwell estate, and may have taken her own life out of guilt over false accusations against her colleagues. Despite Sullivan and Carroll's efforts, the case against Travis for Margot's murder stalled. The prosecutor warned that without direct evidence linking him to the cyanide, a jury might not convict. The art forgery and fraud charges, however, were solid. Both Dean brothers were indicted, with Anthony facing additional charges related to Agnes Blackwell's suspicious death. The scandal rocked Greystone's elite circles, with several prominent families discovering they had unknowingly purchased forged artworks over the years. Halden and Reeves' reputation crumbled overnight. Robert Halden, devastated by the betrayal and scandal, suffered a stroke and retired from public life. The auction house's board of directors voted to sell the business rather than weather the storm. 6 years later, a small art gallery opened in Rockport, Maine. Dean Fine Arts specialized in authentic reproductions of classic works, a business that skirted the line between legitimate art dealing and the gray market. Its owner, Travis Dean, had served 19 months for fraud before being released on good behavior. The murder charge had never stuck. Sullivan, now divorced and still haunted by the case that ended his romantic optimism, occasionally drove up the coast to observe the gallery from afar. He knew in his bones that Travis had killed Margot, but couldn't prove it. The case remained officially open but practically cold. Carol Weber had written a best-selling book about the scandal, Painted Lies, which had been optioned for a limited series. She'd moved to New York, but stayed in touch with Sullivan, calling every few months to check if there were any new leads. There never were. Until a package arrived at the Greystone Police Department, addressed to Detective Michael Sullivan, with no return address. Inside was a single photograph showing Travis Dean at a cafe in Barcelona, sitting across from a man whose face was partially obscured but recognizable to anyone who'd studied the case file, the Swiss chemist who had been questioned, and released, in connection with producing the poison that killed Agnes Blackwell. Paperclipped to the photo was a handwritten note: "He's planning another acquisition. History repeats. M.E. Margot Ellery's initials." Sullivan's hands trembled as he examined the photograph. The timestamp showed it had been taken just 2 weeks ago. The handwriting didn't match Margot's. He'd checked against samples from her notebooks. Someone was playing an elaborate game. Or someone knew something they shouldn't. He called Carol immediately. "I need you back in Greystone. There's been a development." That night, standing before the evidence board in his apartment, the one he'd never taken down, Sullivan added the new photograph. In the corner of his living room, a plaque rescued from the old Halden and Reeve building when it was demolished last year: Margot Ellery, lead appraiser, 1999 to 2010. Below it, someone had carved words into the frame, "She knew the value of truth." Sullivan ran his fingers over the carving, wondering, not for the first time, who had left that tribute. And now, as he studied the mysterious photograph, a new question formed: who was still out there, watching Travis Dean, signing notes with a dead woman's initials? The mystery, it seemed, was far from over. Like the best forgeries, the truth remained elusive, convincing on the surface, but hiding secrets that only the most discerning eye could detect. And somewhere in Greystone, someone was still looking.